Black History Month particularly is about the history of Black diasporas, the history of Black communities from Africa that have lost their history. It's not African History Month, right? I mean, African History Month would be a very different thing. It's Black History Month, and Blackness is a social construct that existed for communities taken from sub-Saharan Africa and put, displaced, where in the end your identity became Black, but that's not really who you were. But you can't find out anymore where you came from because you've been taken away. And that happened just as much, into the Middle East and into South Asia as it had into the United States and the Caribbean and South America and Canada. So I'm somebody who's very passionate about just being very frank and honest about things. Also because I am a Black person who is like my father's Nigerian, I interact with the Nigerian community, I interact with Kenyans, I interact with a lot of Africans. They don't buy this history either. They know their history. They know that before the Portuguese showed up on the coast of East Africa, it was the Arabs. If you're South African, you know that a derogatory term used against Black people is kafir. That started with the Arabs coming in there, right, and saying, writing off every Black person there as being, an unbeliever. So a lot of the ways we're able to talk about Black history in Muslim communities because we're not interacting enough with other Black people. We're just either talking to Muslims or we're talking to other people from the West who probably don't know a lot about sub-Saharan African history either, or the history of slave trade. So, but for me, I can't really let that go because that's not my context as a Black person in Ottawa. Ottawa has a large African community, which is very aware of its history. So I'm always challenged within that community to talk about these issues, and I feel completely comfortable doing that because I don't feel ashamed of talking about the injustices that were done in the name of Islam or the racism that still is perpetuated within Muslim communities against Black peoples and other communities, because it's not, it's not my problem. It's my problem if I'm denying it. It's my problem if I'm making excuses for it. So I think that it's just very important that people realize that silence or just willful ignorance is that is actually making you part of the problem, right? It's hard to admit to shameful historical realities, but it's not it's not everyone's fault, not everyone's to blame. But if you start covering things up or trying to sugarcoat things, that's when you do become a bit like culpable. So one of the things I also would have added was that I would have probably tried to give people direction on how they could learn more. I'm not an academic, but the reality is there's a lot of information available written by academics. So it's not just some random person on YouTube or like some weird blog. It's it's actually like academically researched things written by a variety of people. And I would have given links to those things. On my blog, I've included the article and I've included those links to books and academic articles about the trans-Saharan slave trade, about the Indian Ocean slave trade, which brought Muslims, which was perpetrated by Muslims and took people particularly from Ethiopia across the Middle East to South Asia. I have articles about just the nature of anti-Black racism as it developed, particularly in places like Iraq. And it was actually written about by poets at the time who, probably in some ways might have been the first to articulate a resistance to anti-Black racism. Because again, that Black identity of being Black was constructed as they were in diaspora. So I think these are the important stories for Muslim communities to be talking about, because the reality is that there are issues of racism within our community. We see that with the children. Like I work a lot with children, and you have children who will be using derogatory terms for Black children that they've obviously learned from home or from TV at home, and that's causing fights at school. That's causing divisions. So we need to be addressing this. And also, though, I think I would have added the fact that, again, if we're going to go and look at the issue of slave trade, African slave trades, we also, like, Black African Muslim communities, like, for example, like in Ottawa, it's a large Somali community. Somalia also has a history of slavery, right? That is maybe also hard to explore, too. So, because I know, like, one thing about the article was a lot of members of the Somali community were like, yeah, tell those Arabs. And I was like, well, no, I only wrote about Arabs because I only had that amount of time. I could have unpacked a lot more. and like the reality is that there is a history of slavery in the Somali community. It is actually something which even prejudice against certain other kinds of sub-Saharan Africans. So for example, sub-Saharan Africans with darker skin, with shorter hair, with larger noses, that has actually come up and caused fights with youth I've worked with between Somalis and sort of say youth from South Sudan, youth from Congo. And they're using like Somali words like daga to describe these kids, and they're causing fights, and like, well, where is this coming from, right? So again, everyone needs to go back and look at where they come from, because again, it's always easier to be like, that person's a racist. But the truth is, racism is a human problem. And we all have histories that predate our arrival in the West that follow us. And I think, again, it's easier to concentrate on Western history because it's the most recent, because it's the most written about, because it permeates the popular culture we live in if we're living in Canada. But it's actually not the only history of injustice. It's not the only history of imperialism even. Like, you know, we have other histories of imperialism that still, we're dealing with the repercussions of them to this day. So I think in the end, the larger challenge really is to actually look at your history. Because I think a big problem, and again, it's actually discussed by many academics when they sort of, you know, talk about how Muslims talk about slavery, because, you know, academics are actually talking about how Muslims are talking about slavery, is this weird, like, you know, Muslims will talk about the time of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon them. They'll talk about Bilal, peace and blessings be upon him, and then nothing else. They'll be like, see, you know, we were against racism and we were against slavery, bang. It's like, well, wait a minute, there's like over 1,000 years that happened since then. What actually happened? So I think there's even a larger issue about how we actually talk about Muslim history within our communities. How often, you know, we talk about the perfect time of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, and then we just sort of talk about now how, like, you know, we need to revive that time. It's like, well, how do we get away from that time? What actually happened over the course of, like, you know, over 1,000 years? And unfortunately, a lot of that was, you know, issues of imperialism, even colonialism, not perpetuated by Western Europeans, perpetuated by different communities within the Muslim world that, you know, did create a lot of beautiful buildings and art, but also like a huge amount of social injustice, which we're dealing with the repercussions with to this day. So, and I guess that's sort of, you know, some of the other things I would have written about. But again, it's a huge subject, really, and I'm really happy with the reception to it. I really thought that there would be more negative feedback from it, but it seems that more and more people are ready to start dealing honestly with their histories. And I think that's important because, again, Canada is a multicultural society. I mean, we always talk about that, but like, we really need to think about that, what that means. It means that there are people who have maybe had negative histories with Muslims who are very aware of those histories, and, you know, we're fellow Canadians with them too. And we have to think about what that means because you know, we're very concerned about Islamophobia, but Islamophobia has many roots, and sometimes it is a history of just feeling that you were oppressed by Muslim peoples. And we need to really be exploring that and willing to hear some of that pain and suffering, the way that we want other people to hear the pain and suffering of Muslims around the world. You know, when we're upset about wars and occupation, we want people to be hearing our pain and suffering, but we also have to be willing to do that ourselves for other people's pain and suffering. So I think that that's really, you know, a lot of what I would have talked about if I had had more time. But of course, as you can see, it's a lot to say because even though I really was talking about the enslavement of Black peoples, which of course also, you know, it wasn't just Black peoples who were enslaved in the Muslim world, but definitely Black peoples were enslaved in such a way that, you know, the equation between being Black and being a slave really still exists in the Middle East, particularly with the term abd being used as a derogatory term against Black people. So the reality, and, you know, and even also, again, if I get more into the history, like under the Ottoman Empire, the enslavement of white people versus the enslavement of Black people was actually different. Like there were separate trades. So, you know, again, you know, if people want to come back to me and be like, well, actually Muslims enslaved everyone. Well, no, but they still, like, weren't even enslaved equally if you're Black people. So again, you know, I think that these are unsettling histories, but they're worth exploring, and it's accessible to explore them. I mean, I don't have a university degree, and I still was able to get this information. So if people are interested in the titles and the online academic articles, they can visit my blog. and find them and hopefully read and then continue to learn more and explore more about their particular histories.
MashaAllah, Jazakumullah khairan. You really covered this, but just more succinctly, how is knowing your history gonna help a young child in class stop fighting with other people and stop racism?
I think that knowing history is a very complicated thing. If I think about my own situation, so I'm mixed race, so my mother is French Canadian, German, and my father is Ija, Yoruba from Nigeria, but he was deported when I was a baby, so I didn't really know him. So in many ways, my experience growing up in Canada was very similar to a lot of other people in diaspora, in that, you know, maybe you knew you came from Jamaica, but you really didn't know where your family came before then. I know that exploring my history as a Black person helped in making me feel more secure. Not that I took pride in it. Like, I think often there's this idea that like our history is supposed to give us pride, and I think that's also like a big problem because then it means you only want to hear good in your history. I think that your history just gives you roots. You don't always have to agree with what your ancestors have done, but at least you know where you came from. And I think the big anxiety I had as a child was I didn't see where I fit in history. I didn't, you know, in the history books and in what I was seeing on TV, like I didn't even, it was almost just like I was a new phenomenon as this like mixed race Black kid running around. Like I didn't see where I fit in the world. So I think history is very good for grounding you in the world. I also think particularly for Black children, one of the things I see working with Black youth is that a strange thing ends up happening in a Western context, in our school systems. Black children, from whatever origin they're coming from, start absorbing this anxiety around, they start absorbing a stereotype about Blackness, and they internalize it. So for example, the idea that to be Black is to be an athlete, or to be a Black man is to be an athlete, to be a Black woman is to be sort of sexy, but definitely not smart. So I mean, I've actually worked with children who, you know, were on the honor roll like in junior high and wanted to get off of it because they felt that somehow by showing that they were smart, they were being inauthentically Black. This is not coming from their homes. These are children that came from homes, you know, often their parents are Jamaican or Somali, or, you know, those parents themselves might have had university educations, those parents themselves might have at least wanted that for their children. That's why they came to this country. And yet the child's already absorbed this idea that to be Black is to be stupid, and that's the authentic way to be Black. To be smart and Black is to be white. This is very scary, and this is the kind of thing that I don't see happening with other communities. It's really something that happens with the Black community, and it happens with all Black communities, whether your parents came here, you know, 100 years ago to 10 years ago to 5 years ago. This is happening. So again, I think it's very important for Black children to know Black history, but also their specific history. Because I think a big problem when we say Black history is that, like, we're so general and generalize about it. Like, I think if you're a Somali child, you should know about Somali history. I think if you're a Jamaican child, you should know about Jamaican history. Jamaican history is, you know, the history of the Caribbean is fascinating. Often, you know, when we talk about Black history, we're just talking about African-American history, which is also fascinating and great, but it's not necessarily our history. Like, even there's a fight amongst Black Canadians to just be like learning more about Black Canadian history, because it is here. So I think, again, when we say it's important to know our history, it is, but I think there's a lot of dimensions to our history I have to unpack. But again, I think it's very important for dealing with insecurities, for fighting the stereotypical image of Blackness, which are absorbing. So it's not just like we're fighting the stereotype and it's not in ourselves, it's in us. And we have to, you know, we have to get it out of ourselves. So I think it's very important for that. And then it's also very important, I guess, for wider communities, non-Black communities, to know, because I know definitely in terms of the work I do with, you know, I do a lot of public education work, workshops, that sort of thing, and, you know, so you have a lot of Canadians going to Africa, trying to, like, save Africa, and you're just like, wow, like, they don't even know any Africans here, and it's just like, there's a lot of Africans in Canada. So even people who are trying to help Black peoples around the world have, like, a really weird misconceptions about what actually has happened there, too. So I also think the history of Black peoples, whether it be in the Caribbean, here, Sub-Saharan Africa, is incredibly important, because people are actually trying to make decisions about the lives of Black people with very little information. Really because there is this sense that Blacks have no history, that we haven't created anything, that we haven't come up with solutions to our problems. And that is incredibly dangerous, and we see the effects of that often in really disastrous international development projects in sub-Saharan Africa and in the Caribbean. So I think that's also where it has to become part of the mainstream knowledge about Black history, because, you know, it's affecting everyone.